Before we can begin today's video, I just need to give a content warning for ableism, unethical research, emotional abuse, gaslighting, animal abuse, and references to mugging and war. What if I told you that you weren't aware of your own mind, or the minds of others? What if I told others that you weren't aware of your own mind, even over the sound of you presenting arguments and evidence and anecdotes that could only be produced by someone who was not only self-aware, but keenly aware of my perception of you? You might accuse me of mocking or belittling you, or even trying to undermine you. You might say that I was biased, or that I had something to prove. You would probably call me cruel, or pathetic. Today, we're going to talk about the time that actually happened, and continues to happen, not to one person at the hands of another, but to an entire demographic at the hands of Simon Baron-Cohen, who proposed the theory of mind theory of autism, which asserts that autistic people struggle because we do not have a theory of mind. To be clear, the claim Baron-Cohen made is that autistic people completely lack a theory of mind. That we don't understand that others have minds, or even that we have minds ourselves. He claimed that every autistic person is like this, and that only autistic people have this problem. That is, of course, evidently false. So other researchers tend to fall back on the much softer claim that autistic people have theory of mind deficits and impairments. In fact, Baron-Cohen himself loves to switch between the two. In a work he published in 1991, he says there may be specific delay and deviance in the development of a theory of mind. However, only 4 years later, he decided he was not content with simply claiming that autistic people definitely lack a theory of mind, but that he had to platform someone's disgusting fanfiction, describing in graphic detail how she imagines autistic people see the world. And I do quote, "Around me, bags of skin are draped over chairs and stuffed into pieces of cloth. They shift and protrude in unexpected ways. 2 dark spots near the top of them swivel restlessly back and forth. A hole beneath the spot fills with food, and from it comes a stream of noises. Imagine that the noisy skin bags suddenly moved toward you, and their noises grew loud, and you had no idea why, no way of explaining them or predicting what they would do next." Yet 5 years after that, Baron-Cohen would move back to soft and inoffensive claims, stating that mind-reading deficits in autism spectrum conditions appear to be early occurring. Which is it, Baron-Cohen? Do autistic people merely appear to have deficits and delays in developing theory of mind? Or do we have no theory of mind at all? As for the other researchers we'll be discussing today, while they don't seem to claim themselves that autistic people completely lack a theory of mind, they're all happy to uncritically cite and build on the work of Baron-Cohen, and even collaborate with his mentor. It's important to remember that these people are happy to tolerate and take seriously the idea that autistic people completely lack a theory of mind, to build on that theory and further entrench it, all for the sake of discrediting and undermining the humanity of the very people they claim to want to understand. We also know this isn't a mere error or misunderstanding, as these researchers tacitly admit that the theory holds no water. This is at best an issue of compartmentalization that could only be allowed to exist due to a complete lack of discipline or scientific rigor. These researchers are ableist hacks. But what is a theory of mind? Well, I'd love to give you the definition, but I can't, because it doesn't exist. In fact, some researchers go so far as to admit that they don't know what a theory of mind is, much less how to measure it. Some researchers, however, try to define theory of mind anyway. A 2017 paper by Brewer, Young, and Barnett claims that theory of mind is the ability to interpret others' beliefs, intentions, and emotions. A 2009 paper by White, Hill, Happé, and Frith, on the other hand, says that individuals with autism were shown to have specific problems in understanding other people's mental states, an ability that has come to be known as mentalizing. Finally, the Technical Manual for the Theory of Mind Inventory and Theory of Mind Task Battery explains that theory of mind is a broad and multifaceted construct that is often used interchangeably with the terms perspective taking, metacognition, folk psychology, and social cognition. As much as theory of mind is vague and poorly defined, we can, for the purposes of this video, understand it as the ability to understand what's going on in someone else's head. Looking at it through that lens, it's actually very clear that none of these so-called advanced theory of mind tests even test for theory of mind in the first place. Take, for example, the reading the mind in the eyes task, in which participants are shown pictures of people's eyes and asked to identify their emotions. While you can figure out what's going on in someone's head by looking at someone's facial expression, this isn't the same as the ability to understand what's going on in someone's head. Think of it this way. Do you lose your theory of mind when you speak to someone through a telephone or instant messages? This isn't a test for theory of mind. This is a test for the ability to intuit people's emotions by looking at their eyes. Can you really say that's the same as theory of mind? Brewer, Young, and Barnett seem to think it is, as they acknowledged the reading the mind in the eyes task as a legitimate way to measure theory of mind in adults. However, they also seem to think that reading faces is unimportant, as they decided to measure theory of mind with Harper's Strange Stories task, a task which features no faces at all. Which is it? Is theory of mind dependent on reading faces, or is reading faces entirely optional? It's almost as if the reading the mind in the eyes task was designed by picking something autistic people notoriously suck at and then inventing a flimsy justification for linking it to theory of mind after the fact. These are not good tests. They're unscientific tests engineered to bring about the desired result. Proof that autistic people are subhuman. Unfortunately, I don't have the qualifications necessary for my criticisms of these tests to be taken seriously in academia, and my criticisms wouldn't be taken seriously even if I did. Leaving aside the tendency of so-called experts to dismiss autistic people as biased whenever we claim to know anything about autism, there have been pointed criticisms of Baron-Cohen's work going back more than a decade. Yet, people have built on his work at least as recently as 2017. Academic criticism isn't an option, but what I can do is give a detailed autistic perspective on the problems with these tests to put out a counter-narrative for autistic people who have been taught that their way of thinking is simple and disordered, and to give allistic people, that is, non-autistic people, insight into anti-autistic prejudice and autistic ways of thinking. Before we continue though, I need to note that, since these are largely my personal thoughts, they're biased towards autistic people who are speaking, who are neurotypical passing, who are considered high-functioning, who were diagnosed young, who were put through abusive ABA therapy, who grew up with other kinds of abuse, who are Australian, who are white, who are trans, who are queer, etc. Autism is a broad spectrum, autism is affected by its intersection with other identities, and autistic people are complex individuals, so none of the explanations I give today are going to apply to all of us. Other autistic people are going to have other responses to these tests. However, we can still be certain that these tests don't prove that even a subset of autistic people lack a theory of mind because, like I said before, they don't test for theory of mind to begin with. The worst of these tests is arguably the animated triangles task. In this task, participants are shown animations of triangles moving in 3 different ways, randomly, in a goal-oriented fashion, and in a way which implies interaction and intentions. On the surface, this looks like a test for theory of mind. But it isn't, because these triangles aren't human. The researchers also don't explain to the participants that these triangles are meant to represent humans or human-like entities. This means that before the animated triangles task can test for theory of mind, it needs to test for whether or not participants will assume that entities they've never seen before behave like humans, with the tacit assertion that people who don't make that assumption are unintelligent and have something wrong with them. This belief isn't just disrespectful to autistic people, it does real harm. For example, in a viral TikTok video, a man quote-unquote tickled a sea ray. A lot of people saw the sea ray as smiling and laughing, but the truth is that the ray was stressed and afraid and dying of suffocation. For an example a little closer to home, and a little more likely to happen in your own life, research suggests that dogs don't feel guilt after breaking rules. What you interpret as guilty body language from your dog is more likely stressful and fearful body language in response to you scolding them. Your impulse to assume that your dog thinks and acts like a human is causing you to do what they likely perceive as threatening them for no reason. A reluctance to assume that other living things behave and think like humans significantly reduces the amount of harm in the world. Yet the animated triangles task pathologizes it as evidence of a disordered and defective mind. What's interesting is the many people who called out the TikTok video aren't pathologized as lacking a theory of mind, and the many vets who can advise you on how to properly train and interact with your dog are, if anything, considered more empathetic and aware. This behavior is only demonized when it's perceived as an autistic trait, because the alternative is admitting that, just this once, neurotypical people are flawed in a way that autistic people aren't. Now, I only have one more theory of mind test I want to discuss today, but that's because it's flawed in so many ways that trying to discuss any other story-based theory of mind task would be redundant. That test is Harper's Strange Stories task, in which participants are told short stories involving someone saying something that is not literally true, their words not mine, then asked questions about them. Keep in mind that these stories are supposed to be suitable for both adults and children. Here's one story as an example. During the war, the Red Army captures a member of the Blue Army. They want him to tell them where his army's tanks are. They know they are either by the sea or in the mountains. They know that the prisoner will not want to tell them. He will want to save his army, and so he will certainly lie to them. The prisoner is very brave and very clever. He will not let them find his tanks. The tanks are really in the mountains. Now when the other side asks him where his tanks are, he says, they are in the mountains. For this story, participants are asked, why did the prisoner say that? If a participant answers with, to save his army's tanks, they only get half marks, despite their answer being 100% true. If a participant answers with, to mislead them, they also only get half marks. How do you get full marks for this question? Well, you have to explain that the Red Army will not believe the prisoner and will therefore look in the other place, and that the prisoner will realize this. Alternatively, you need to reference a double bluff. This is despite the fact that recognizing the prisoner is trying to mislead the Red Army is already an allusion, i.e. a reference, to a double bluff. Let's look at another one. Late one night, old Mrs. Peabody is walking home. She doesn't like walking home alone in the dark because she is always afraid that someone will attack her and rob her. She really is a very nervous person. Suddenly, out of the shadows comes a man. He wants to ask Mrs. Peabody what time it is, so he walks toward her. When Mrs. Peabody sees the man coming toward her, she starts to tremble and says, "Take my purse, just don't hurt me, please." For this story, participants are asked, why did she say that? Again, participants only receive half marks for saying that she's nervous, that she's scared, or that she said what she said so that the man wouldn't hurt her, in spite of all of these answers being 100% true. Participants only get full marks if they directly reference her false belief. The problem with these marking criteria is that they're written without an appreciation for the broadness of the question. Explaining the outcome someone was hoping to achieve is no more or less an explanation of why than explaining the beliefs underlying their behavior. Moreover, explaining what someone is thinking and feeling is just as much a demonstration of theory of mind as explaining what someone thinks someone else is thinking or feeling. Less complex maybe, but still undoubtedly a demonstration of theory of mind. The researchers want highly specific answers to a vague question, and they're assuming that anyone who doesn't give the answers they want must not know the answers, rather than considering that the questions are unclear and that the participants don't understand what the researchers are asking. Ironically, the researchers are showing an inability to consider and infer the mental states of their participants. And again, there's a lack of respect for different viewpoints. Researchers personally find intent and belief-focused explanations more compelling, but rather than recognize this as their personal preference, they're taking it as a sign of their own sophistication. In the process, they fail to realize that someone can understand the beliefs and thought processes behind someone's actions, and yet still prefer to focus on the outcome of the situation anyway. In fact, sometimes outcome-focused explanations can be the best way to approach a situation. In my work online, I often find it easier to use outcome-focused explanations to interpret the behavior of certain creators I interact with. A common dilemma I face is when there's more than one possible motivation for their behavior. For example, it's not always easy to tell whether a creator is saying something untrue because of genuine ignorance, because of malice, because of gross negligence, or because of the sunken cost fallacy, or even a mix of these things. It's especially difficult to tell given that compartmentalization allows for people to have contradictory motivations and beliefs. So it's often best to simply establish whether or not the creator could reasonably be expected to access the necessary information, assuming they did their due diligence. Autistic people may also see our outcome-focused explanations as ones which explain the underlying beliefs and thought processes of the character. Why? Personally, I find their beliefs and thought processes are implied, and I can see the logical connection easily. If the prisoner gives the true location of his army's tanks in order to save them, it must be a double bluff. Calling it a double bluff explicitly is pointing out something so obvious that I can see why some people think it should go without saying. It's also possible that failure on this test is a result of the abuse autistic people are put through for being autistic. Personally, I grew up with my whole family scolding, judging, and mocking me for giving them information that they considered too detailed or irrelevant. As a toddler, I even had a speech therapist criticize me for going on a tangent when I was in speech therapy that was supposed to help me get over my reluctance to talk. I was criticized for going on a tangent when I was a toddler who was too shy to talk. Fact is, in everyday conversation, it's considered inappropriate, annoying, and even rude to spell things out that are considered obvious. It's actually a violation of one of Grice's maxims, which is a set of 4 guidelines invented by Paul Grice, a philosopher of language, to explain how we communicate with each other. In particular, it's a violation of the maxim of quantity. In the words of Tom Scott, "Vegan burgers are a sensible thing to find on the supermarket shelf, but vegan tomatoes wouldn't be. In fact, those tomatoes would sound a bit suspicious." The maxim of quantity asserts that you should give as much information as is needed and no more. Now, the maxim I violated in speech therapy was actually the maxim of relation, but that experience still shows the unrealistic and frankly abusive standards autistic people are held to when it comes to quote-unquote normal behavior. If a toddler who's seen as Allistic goes on a tangent, that's seen as a baby being a baby. But when an autistic toddler does it, that's seen as a fault that needs to be corrected immediately. After a lifetime of being punished and abused for failing to follow social conventions like Grice's maxims stringently, it's unfair for researchers to expect autistic people to break them on command. Habits deeply entrenched by violence cannot just be broken at will. Speaking of the impact of childhood experiences, some autistic people have experiences of being reined in and even punished at school for trying to understand what we're being taught with too much nuance or complexity, especially if we point out that what we're being taught is oversimplified to the point of falsehood. It's possible that some of the participants in this experiment gave oversimplified answers, not because they didn't understand, but because they've learned that neurotypical people don't like it when they quote-unquote overcomplicate things. They may have believed that sophisticated answers to these questions were too complicated for the researchers' liking and would have been marked wrong. In fact, those participants would be justified in worrying about that, because Harper's stories only make sense if you ignore a number of glaring flaws. The story of the Red Army and the Blue Army, for example, conveniently ignores the possibility of the Red Army calling the prisoner's bluff, and further ignores the possibility of the prisoner worrying that the Red Army might call his bluff. Many of the stories also don't require theory of mind at all, because they have obvious solutions which circumvent theory of mind entirely. In Mrs. Peabody's case, she could have asked the man what he wanted or waited for him to tell her before offering up her purse. That's generally how muggings work, is you don't give up your belongings until you've been threatened. One story oversimplifies things in a particularly unfair way, and it goes like this. Simon is a big liar. Simon's brother Jim knows this. He knows that Simon never tells the truth. Now yesterday Simon stole Jim's ping pong paddle and Jim knows Simon has hidden it somewhere, though he can't find it. He's very cross. So he finds Simon and he says, "Where is my ping pong paddle? You must have hidden it either in the cupboard or under your bed, because I've looked everywhere else. Where is it? In the cupboard or under your bed?" Simon tells him the paddle is under his bed. Then participants are asked, why will Jim look in the cupboard for the paddle? Immediately there's an obvious criticism. The chances of anyone, much less a child, successfully searching everywhere in the house without missing anything is less than 0. That seems like a petty criticism, but it significantly changes the nature of the story. If we accept that Jim really did search everywhere else to exhaustion, then that raises the question of why he didn't just search in the cupboard and under Simon's bed as well. Again, there's an obvious solution which completely bypasses theory of mind. However, if we do not accept that Jim searched everywhere else to exhaustion, or we allow for another possibility like Simon moving the paddle to a place Jim has already searched, then there's a possibility that the paddle isn't in the cupboard or under Simon's bed, which makes asking Simon completely useless. It also changes the nature of Simon's lie, making it a lie designed to waste time rather than a lie for the sake of a lie. Speaking of, no one is guaranteed to lie 100% of the time. Something Harper's Strange Stories task does a lot is assign characters immutable traits that they have to follow, even when following those traits doesn't make sense, like Mrs. Peabody's nervousness. When children lie, they're usually either trying to cover up a wrongdoing to avoid punishment, or they're trying to be cruel to other children for their own amusement. In this case, Simon is clearly being cruel. As someone who grew up with a brother who liked to lie in order to be cruel, this story immediately struck me as overly simplified. If it had been my brother who I'd asked about the paddle, he wouldn't have lied. He would have told me the truth about where the paddle was. Why? Because he knew I would have assumed he was lying and looked in the other place, and he knew that telling the truth would do 2 things. In the short term, it would hurt me more to be met with the dissonance of someone who was telling the truth while still somehow being dishonest, and in the long term, it would destabilize my trust in what my brother tells me. It would gaslight me, by establishing that I can't predict whether or not my brother will lie or bluff with the truth. Granted, most kids aren't as cruel as my brother was, but many still realize that lying about the location of the paddle wouldn't work if they already have a reputation for lying. People who have a reputation for lying do tell the truth sometimes because the truth becomes a more effective method of deceit. They double bluff. What makes this story particularly cruel is, unlike the other stories, this story resembles something participants would have likely experienced in their life. But, because of the design of the story, applying those experiences would actually put the participants at a disadvantage. This task, allegedly designed to test her theory of mind, shows you as having a weak theory of mind if you give answers in line with your past experiences of applying theory of mind. Now, Harper claimed autistic people who pass theory of mind tests are using their language skills to hack out the tests. You might expect me to argue with that, to give you a reason why it isn't true. But I agree wholeheartedly. Everyone who takes her test is using their language skills to hack out the answer, because her test is a charade. If we go back to the story of the Red Army and the Blue Army, one of the answers which gets you 0 marks is saying that the prisoner was scared. But why is that? Telling the truth out of fear is a valid response. Well, it's because the story explicitly tells you that the prisoner was brave in order to rule out that possibility. The story also explicitly tells you that the Red Army quote-unquote knows that the prisoner will lie to them in order to rule out an infinite regress of bluffs. In the story of Mrs. Peabody, they do the opposite. They tell you that she's afraid of someone robbing her not in order to rule out a possibility, but in order to make her extreme response make sense. The stories straight up give you half of the answers. The simple fact is, you're never going to be in a situation where someone comes along and tells you detailed, immutable facts about someone's character, motivations, or beliefs. No one is ever going to tell you, that person there lies 100% of the time and everyone knows it, or the old lady down the street has an irrational fear that everyone is looking to mug her. Half of the work of figuring out what's going on in someone's head is taking the time to observe them and learn about their character. On the rare occasion that someone does tell you about someone's character explicitly, you have to use your knowledge of their character to weigh up the possibility that they're lying or biased or mistaken. There are no objective narrators in real life, but there are objective narrators in reading comprehension tasks, which is all this is. It's a glorified reading comprehension task. Worse, it's a reading comprehension task based on inferring, and inferring is, at least in my own experience, an absolute nightmare for autistic people. Enter the double empathy problem. The double empathy problem is a theory proposed by an autistic academic, Damien Milton, which puts forward the idea that autistic people and allistic people have a mutual difficulty understanding each other because of our different ways of thinking and our different experiences. It's not that autistic people lack a theory of mind or even have theory of mind deficits, but that we're at a disadvantage because we're expected to understand people who are different from us, while allistic people are only expected to understand people who are the same. Since we have to practice constantly from birth, a lot of autistic people learn to compensate for this disadvantage enough to get by in day-to-day life, but reading comprehension tasks are different. Not only do you have to infer from extremely limited information given to you on someone else's terms, but you aren't inferring the truth as defined by reality. You're inferring the truth as defined by the person who designed the task. Ironically, Happé's Strange Stories task does require a complex and multi-layered application of theory of mind, just not in the way you'd expect. Since the test is made up of hypotheticals set by allistic people, we're already one step removed from reality. Rather than interpreting the thoughts and behaviors of allistic people directly, autistic participants have to interpret how allistic people think they think and behave. It's the difference between you attempting to describe your friend's personality to me versus you attempting to tell me how your friend would describe their own personality to me. Yet these things are treated as the same. Happé and her colleagues are also responsible for the marking key, so autistic participants are not only working with an allistic's interpretation of how allistic people think and behave, but they're graded based on how closely their interpretation matches how Happé and her colleagues think another allistic person will interpret their facsimile of allistic behavior. So, it's as if you were trying to tell me how your friend thinks their personality would be described by another friend, while your friend judges your answers, and this is still being treated like you're just describing your friend's personality. Autistic participants also have to work with contrived and unrealistic stories, meaning that the characters will think and behave in unrealistic ways. So autistic participants need to take all of these biases into account while they try to divine how Happé and her colleagues think allistic people will think and behave in situations that would never occur in real life. Autistic participants also need to divine exactly how complex their answers need to be in order to be accepted by Happé and her colleagues, including which of the story's details they're expected to take seriously, which details they're expected to play along with, and which details they're expected to ignore. Autistic participants also need to make these interpretations about people who they are unfamiliar with and who, by definition, think in a way that is unintuitive to them. Can we also take a moment to acknowledge what a hostile environment testing is for anyone who doesn't conform? Even assuming the most benevolent and unbiased tester in the world, you get 1, 2, maybe 3 chances to divine the answer the tester has decided is correct, based only on the knowledge that they choose to give you. And if you don't, you're assumed to be the one with the problem. You're not allowed to ask for clarification or additional information, you're not allowed to argue for why your answer is correct, and you're certainly not allowed to question the test itself. It's not that you'll be given failing marks if you do, it's considered a breach of the testing protocol, and you will be punished for it. More than anything, I think the determining factor in whether you pass or fail a test is whether the test's creator or the examiner wants you to pass or fail. After all, it's rigged on every level. These tests are definitely rigged, at the very least. How do I know? I hinted at it before. It's because, despite the overwhelming odds, autistic people did manage to pass. And when they did, the researchers accused them of using some unknown strategy to circumvent the test. Then they invented another test, and another one, and another one, in an attempt to get the results that they wanted. That isn't just my opinion. When Baron-Cohen and his colleagues realized that their pet theory was incompatible with the existence of autistic adults, they asserted that autistic adults have a selective theory of mind deficit, and that existing theory of mind tests are not subtle enough to detect that deficit. I have to ask Baron-Cohen, if someone has a deficit so subtle and so selective that you haven't managed to detect it yet, how can it have such a profound impact on their life? What, meaningfully, is the difference between a cognitive deficit you cannot perceive and a cognitive deficit that does not exist? And a cognitive deficit that does not exist. Even after numerous attempts, their own tests cannot provide tangible evidence of any theory of mind deficit, but they'll assume it exists anyway, and that they just need the right test to prove it. That's where all these theory of mind tests are coming from. The reading the mind in the eyes task? That was invented by Baron-Cohen in 1997. Then revised by Baron-Cohen in 2001, when he decided the initial version of his test wasn't sensitive to subtle cognitive dysfunction. Happé's Strange Stories task? Happé straight up admitted that she created it because she didn't like the results she was getting. And I do quote, "Research has suggested that the core handicaps of autism result from a specific impairment in theory of mind. However, this account has been challenged by the finding that a minority of autistic subjects pass first and even second-order theory of mind tests while remaining socially handicapped. In the present study, able autistic subjects who failed theory of mind tasks, those who passed first-order, and those who passed second-order tasks were tested with a battery of more naturalistic and complex stories. The animated triangles task? Both Frith and Happé were on the team responsible for that. The study is also clearly building on Baron-Cohen's work, and it regurgitates the idea that you can prove autistic people are broken if only your tests are good enough. It's frankly antagonistic. They talk as if autistic people are maliciously trying to ruin their theory and need to be outsmarted. You might be tempted to ask why they would do this, why they would keep beating the same dead horse of a theory for more than 30 years. But I don't want to do that. Like most people, Baron-Cohen and friends think they're doing the right thing, or a right thing, or, at worst, a wrong thing that was understandable and excusable. It would be so unbelievably messed up for me to sit here as an autistic person and use my theory of mind that Baron-Cohen insists I do not have to explain why his assertion that I'm not human was some understandable mistake. That's not because it isn't an understandable mistake. It is. But because Baron-Cohen and friends are not the victims in this situation. We don't have to try to understand them. Instead, we can save our empathy and our willingness to learn for the people who actually deserve it. The autistic people that Baron-Cohen and his colleagues have worked to dehumanize since well before I was born. The fact that Baron-Cohen's mistake is understandable doesn't mean that it's excusable. It means that the ableism in our society is deep-rooted and pervasive, and trying to empathize with it only makes the problem worse. So please, save your energy for listening to autistic voices. If you got something valuable from this video, and you would like to support two autistic creators, consider becoming a subscriber or patron of Essence of Thought, where most of my work can be found. I co-host fortnightly live streams on there, I run the Essence of Community Discord, and I edit video scripts for content, structure, readability, tone, grammar and punctuation, formatting, and accuracy. Since Ethel relies on Patreon in order to survive, donations really help me sleep at night, so I would be most grateful to anyone who can chip in. even if you can only give $1 a month. Thank you for supporting my family.